Over the years you will have read and heard an awful lot about my life and times. Some of it has been true, some of it has been a pack of lies, and some of it has been just plain daft. Until now my opportunities to set the record straight have been strictly limited. The gag imposed by cricket's ruling bodies has made sure of that. Now my retirement from the game in the summer of '93 means that the gag has been removed. For the first time I have a real chance to tell my side of the story. In fact, now I have a chance to tell my side of all the stories. I'm no angel, I never have been and never will be. How my wife Kath has stood by me through some of the problems we have encountered at the hands of the gutter press, I'll never know. But overall, the good times have far outnumbered the bad. I don't feel any need to justify my life or my actions to anyone. What I want to do is introduce you to the real Ian Botham. I hope you enjoy what you hear.
Ian Botham, My Autobiography, read by Robin Asquith. I knew it was all over the morning it took me 5 minutes to get out of bed. It was 2 days after I had played for Durham against Glamorgan in the second round of the NatWest Trophy at Cardiff in the midsummer of 1993. Hip, knee, shoulder. It was difficult to distinguish one pain from another. I was worn out. Sitting on the edge of the bed that morning, I realized my body was sending me a message I couldn't ignore. To borrow Tony Gregg's well-worn phrase, it was good night, Beefy. For many sportsmen, this is the moment they dread above all others. But since 1988, when I was given an opportunity to extend my career by undergoing back surgery, I knew I was playing on borrowed time. In grabbing that time, and making the most of it, I will always be grateful to the skill of surgeon John Davies. Now, however, after 20 years, my love affair with playing cricket was over. I had intended that 1993 would be my last as a professional cricketer, but I had been determined to go out at the top. I said in April that I was aiming to win back my England place and play in the Ashes series against the Australians, and I meant it. I was convinced I had plenty to offer, especially after England's woeful performance on the winter tour to India and Sri Lanka, where they had been humiliated. Graham Gooch played the best cricket of his career, leading from the front and passing David Gower's record as England's highest run scorer in Test cricket. But I've always found that, as captain, what he couldn't come to terms with was that the right way for him was not necessarily the best for everyone. With the Indian fiasco, I think his biggest mistake was allowing himself to be persuaded to go in the first place. I would never criticise anyone for missing a winter tour. As players get older, the amount of international cricket played and the pressure involved, as well as the business of leaving your family for months at a time, mean that if you don't take an occasional winter break, you are vulnerable to burnout. But if Gooch wasn't keen enough to take the job without having his arm twisted, then he shouldn't have gone at all. Once he made the decision, he then had the bright idea of surrounding himself with his old mates, John Embry and Mike Gatting, and discarding David Gower, an omission that England paid for dearly. For my money, there were people on that tour who played as though they lacked desire and pride. Once things started to go wrong, they simply gave up the ghost. And by sending out a pastoral counsellor, the Reverend Wingfield Digby, instead of a team doctor, the Teston County Cricket Board proved once again that the lunatics had taken over the asylum. I don't go along with much of what Ray Illingworth, the new chairman of selectors, has said since taking over at the start of the 1994 season, but even he had the sense to see that wingers diggers was surplus. Even though the Indian tour had been a disaster, I was under no illusions about how hard it would be for me to regain my place. After the 1992 World Cup in Australia, where I ended up a two-time loser in the final against Pakistan, my critics would have been quite happy for me to have disappeared from international cricket. But I was still enthusiastic about a comeback, and hoping that the selectors, on the evidence of the Indian tour, would give me one last chance. So when I produced the goods in the traditional opening fixture of the Australian tour, for the Duchess of Norfolk's 11 at Arundel in May, I felt confident that the message must get through, particularly as one of my victims was Alan Border, the Australian captain and my mate and rival. In addition, Ted Dexter, the chairman of the selectors, was there to see what I could still do. I had been keyed up for the match. The night before, all the talk was of producing a vintage performance to stake my claim to the all-rounder's position. There was enormous interest in the match, as there always is when the Aussies are in town, and I like to think that many of the 16,000 capacity crowd were there to see me put on a show against the old enemy. Certainly the seriousness with which the Australians approached the match was not in doubt. When I was hit for 4 in my first over, some visiting Antipodean shouted out, "It's 93 now, mate, not 81. I had the greatest delight in silencing him a few minutes later when I removed Damien Martin. However, unbeknown to me, Dexter was in the process of pulling the rug from under me. When I heard of the content of the radio interview he had given after I had bowled that day, I hit the roof. I was in the bar relaxing after the match when a couple of journalists told me what had happened. Apparently Dexter had been asked what he thought of my bowling. "Are the Australians trying to play him into the side?" he muttered, as if the Aussies were trying to con the selectors into picking me by throwing their wickets away. Anyone who knows the slightest thing about them also knows that getting out to me is the last thing an Aussie wants to do, especially Border. The ball that bowled him at Arundel went through the gate between bat and pad as he tried to push it through the offside. That was a weakness of Border's which I had proved successfully in the World Cup match in Sydney, where I managed to take 4 wickets in 7 deliveries without conceding a run, scored 53, and the Australians lost their chance of qualifying for the final stages. Wisden wrote, "The combination of the old enemy, the bright lights, and the noisily enthusiastic crowd demanded a showstopper from Botham, and he provided it. I shouldn't be surprised if Dexter thought Border gave me his wicket that night as well." Now I worked myself up into such a fury that I demanded an apology from Dexter. 2 days later the phone rang at home. It was Ted. He mumbled something about what he had said being a throwaway line, which he had come up with, because he wanted to avoid the interview being all about Ian Botham. It didn't wash. After all, I'd just bowled the Australian captain, and the first thing any interviewer was going to ask him about was my England prospects. Dexter went on to offer, by way of bizarre justification, "You're the master of the one-liner, Ian. Look at what you said about Pakistan being the kind of place you would send your mother-in-law to for a paid holiday." "Yes, Ted," I replied, "and the board fined me £1,000 for that one." In the end he did apologise, and that was all I wanted. What did amaze me was that the TCCB let the whole sorry episode rest without further comment. If it had been a player who had opened his mouth and said what Dexter had done, there would have been an almighty stink. But that was the end of the incident, and of my hopes for a final season of Test cricket. In his prime, Ted Dexter was a brilliant all-round sportsman. He has also always been considered an oddball. People who played under him as captain often said that he would wander about in a world of his own, and he was renowned for reacting to moments of high pressure by practicing golf swings in the slips. As far as I was concerned, however, he crossed the line between eccentricity and idiocy far too often for someone who was supposed to be running English cricket. Ted retired from the game long before I had started, so the first time he made any real impression on me was as a television commentator. But it was in the summer of 1989 that I had my first brush with the wackier side of Ted. He had just become chairman of the English committee with promises of a more professional approach for English cricket after years in the doldrums. We had arrived in Birmingham for the 3rd test against Australia, and were due to meet in the hotel conference room for the customary pre-match meal and tactical team talk. Although those who have played Test cricket with me will tell you that my input was normally minimal and usually confined to, "He can't bat, I'll bounce him out," it's true that what is discussed in these meetings can make the difference between winning and losing. This time, however, Ted turned it into a night out at Butlins. As we filed in, Ted was handing out song sheets. I couldn't believe my eyes. There, in black and white, was the score to the hymn "Onward Christian Soldiers," while underneath Ted's own version, entitled "Onward Gowers Cricketers." "Onward Gowers Cricketers, striving for a score. With our bats uplifted, we want more and more. Alderman the master represents the foe. Forward into battle, down the pitch we go. Onward Gowers Cricketers, striving for a score. Don't despair too early, the lions soon will roar." Onward and onward it went. "Right," said Ted. "Now look, lads, when you get in the bath tonight, I want you to sing this at the top of your voices." I thought to myself, what the hell is going on? Whatever he's drinking, I'll have a pint. But my opinion of Ted is not just based on the obvious gaffes. It was during that series of 1989 that I found not only was Dexter a man I could not respect, he was also a man I could not rely on. Our performances throughout that series were undistinguished, to say the least. We started off on the wrong foot. After the 1988 winter tour to India had been called off, due to the Indian Board of Control's objection to players who had been on the first Rebel tour to South Africa in 1982, England were looking for a new captain. The original choice of Dexter and the manager Mickey Stewart had been Mike Gatting, but when that was vetoed by the chairman of the TCCB, Ozzie Wheatley, they turned reluctantly to David Gower. That meant England going into a vital series with a captain who the selectors had not wanted. When I returned to the side after injury for the third test at Edgbaston, we were already 2 down, and no one was sure who was running things, Gower, Stewart or Dexter. At the same time, the South African cricket authorities were recruiting players for another rebel tour to be played that winter while the test side were due to take on the West Indies. The dressing room was awash with rumours of who was going. It had reached the stage where the England committee asked players to sign a declaration of availability for the winter tour. I had been targeted by the South Africans in a big way, and the cash for signing up for 2 winter tours was staggering. Even when I asked for £500,000, the organisers did not seem unduly perturbed. Everyone understood that those who did go could more or less kiss goodbye to Test cricket, but then most of my Test career was already behind me. Mickey, however, on behalf of the England management, was doing his best to persuade me not to go. They wanted me in the West Indies, he said, and he pleaded with me to make myself available. I was more or less guaranteed a place on the plane. Once again, as I had in 1982, I came to the conclusion that I had more to lose than gain. The bottom line was pride, professional and patriotic. The West Indies were the one side against whom I still had something to prove, and I wanted another crack. So I informed Mickey of my availability, and he accepted the news gratefully. Then, the night before the squad for the tour was to be announced, Ted was on the line. "Hello, Ian," he said. "I'm afraid we're not taking you to the West Indies." "You what?" I uttered disbelievingly. "I have just rearranged my whole life for you. You begged me to go." Well, I didn't personally," he replied feebly. I felt like I had been stabbed in the back. I went berserk and slammed the phone down on him. I don't think I've ever felt so devastated. I emptied 2 bottles of brandy in an effort to get the rage out of my system. Then, to really rub it in, Mickey and Ted denied that they had persuaded me to make myself available. As far as I'm concerned, their denials were a lie. I'm sure it is the hope of every father who plays professional sport that he will one day be able to watch his son performing at the same or a higher level. I have not proved the exception to the rule, even though I have never pushed Liam. But he is a naturally gifted sportsman and, as my son, also prey to the long lens treatment. He was selected to play for England under-15s against the touring South African boys in 1992 and showed enough talent to be offered a summer spell with Hampshire. On his first day at work, a second 11 match against Worcestershire at Southampton, his club captain Mark Nicholas told me that he had never seen so many reporters at the county ground. Liam took the whole thing in his stride, even being relaxed enough to tell the assembled throng that he intended to be even better than his dad, cheeky bugger. Liam, being a Botham, then managed to play a good game as well as talk one by taking 4 wickets. Of course, I would have loved to have played with or against Liam at county level, and I was delighted when he was brought in as a last-minute replacement for a charity match between the rest of the world and my own England 11 at Hove, a few weeks before I announced my retirement. I don't regret many things in my life, but the circumstances surrounding my final game have left me with a tinge of guilt. Although I was more than happy to be bowing out against the Aussies, it was such a spontaneous decision that I didn't even tell my parents about it. As usual, it is the people nearest to you that you think about least. In all likelihood, my father would have wanted to be there for my swan song. In some ways, it was a relief that the game itself was a non-event. On the third and final day's play, with the news out, the ground was like a circus. There was a press conference that lasted 55 minutes, probably the longest of my career. And though the rain destroyed any prospect of a result, contrived or otherwise, the crowd was marvellous, and the skies cleared enough for us to play for 3 or 4 hours in the afternoon. In my final spell of bowling, I decided to have a bit of fun, doing my Jeff Thompson impersonations, among others. Then, after a few overs, I turned to David Graveney, the Durham captain, and said, "Thanks, David. I think that will do." It was quite a moment. As I turned to take my position in the field, the reality of what I was doing suddenly hit me. No more bowling, no more batting, no more anything. The pavilion clock showed there was still half an hour to go, but that was it for me. My time was over. Both batsmen, David Boone and Matthew Hayden, came down the wicket to shake my hand, and I cannot remember anything that happened between that moment and the time stumps were drawn. Except, I do recall my appalling attempt at keeping wicket for the final over of the match, minus pads and gloves. However, I was soon brought back to earth when at the close of play I went into the dressing room to clear my locker. The bastards had pinched the lot. There was a time 3 months into my mother Marie's pregnancy when the entire Ian Botham story might have been over before it had even begun. Both my parents had been good at sport and highly competitive. Les, who was a keen cricketer, ran for East Yorkshire, had a soccer trial for Hull City boys, and played for combined services, while Marie had played cricket, badminton and hockey to a reasonable standard. However, they had acute difficulties in starting a family. Marie had suffered 4 miscarriages before she became pregnant with me, and there were real fears that she was going to miscarry again. Towards the end, she was confined to bed, and Les, serving in the Fleet Air Arm, was stationed in Northern Ireland, so he was absent when the time came for Marie to enter the maternity hospital in Heswold, Cheshire. There must have been an overpowering sense of relief when, on a drizzly 24th of November 1955, the first shout was heard from a bouncing 10-pound 1-ounce baby, Ian Terence Botham. Once on the planet, it seems I was determined to make my mark. The family moved to Londonderry, where we were put up in Service's married quarters. Mum recalls how she left me inside a playpen in the living room while she was working in the kitchen. A few minutes later, she was surprised to find me crawling around her feet. Puzzled, she carried me back to the playpen. When I appeared in the kitchen for the 3rd time, she realised something was up and decided to keep an eye on me. She couldn't believe her eyes. I was lifting the edge of the playpen onto my box of toys, crawling out under the gap, and then pulling the playpen down to the floor again, leaving everything in the right place, except me. Once I'd found a way out of my confinement, that was the start of my adventures, and nothing was going to stop me. If I was left outside in my pram, brake or no brake, I would bounce it up and down until I succeeded in getting the thing moving. By the time my sister Dale was born, in February 1957, I have one other sister, Wendy, and a brother, Graham, I was 15 months old, up on my own feet and walking. Of course, that posed a new set of problems for Mum and Dad, who were constantly trying to contain my wanderlust. But for baby Botham, if it was there to be scaled, and often the only evidence of me ever having been in the garden was a pair of dungarees left hanging on the fence. After 18 months, we moved from Cheshire, and then Dad took up a position with Western Helicopters. For the next 6 years, home was 64 Mudford Road, Yeovil. The house backed onto the playing fields of Yeovil Grammar School, where I could often be found watching the older boys playing cricket. But my love affair with sport began in earnest when I moved from Miss Wright's private school at Penmount to Milford Junior School in September 1962. I discovered that if you stayed for school dinner, you could also play football. Richard Hibbert, the deputy headmaster, saw how keen I was and was soon picking me for the school team. That was all the encouragement I needed, and by the ripe old age of 7 I was practicing my autograph for the day when I would be famous. I didn't have to wait long for my first appearance on national television, although songs of praise from St John's in Yeovil was not exactly what I had in mind. Although I had been bowling daisy cutters at the garage door from the age of 6 and disappearing into the local park for games of cricket at every available opportunity, Mr Hibbert showed me that there was money to be made from sport. He placed a pile of coins on a good length on the pitch and told us that if we managed to hit them, the cash was ours. I cleaned up, as I did later when at 13 I made my debut for Somerset under-15s against Wiltshire. The deal was 6pence per run, and my score of 80 ensured a jackpot which my dad was forced to cough up. By the time I moved to secondary school, my sheer bloody-mindedness about getting my own way was well established. In general, I enjoyed myself. My lack of aptitude for an academic life was well known by my mates, who gave me the nickname of Bungalow, nothing upstairs. But all my life I possessed extraordinary self-belief. Even then I had no doubts that when I grew up I was going to be a professional sportsman. And that was what my only real adolescent battles at home were over, my absolute determination to make a career out of sport. My parents were worried about what would happen if I failed to make the grade or was badly injured. When, after I had succeeded in escaping from school at 15, Somerset arranged for me to go to Lord's, Roy Kerslake, a prominent member of the county's cricket committee, had to do the hard sell on my dad. As far as I was concerned, however, the only choice I had to make was which sport to concentrate on. I already had an offer to join Crystal Palace Football Club, and I asked Dad for advice, as there were other clubs, 5 from the First Division, as I recall, who were after me as well. Les said, "Right, son, I think you're a better cricketer," and that was the decision made. Clearly, my single-mindedness has been vital in my career. All sportsmen who make it to the top have to be ultra-competitive. As a kid, I simply had to win at everything, and that desire to be number 1 has never left me. I make no apologies for the way I've conducted myself, and I have no regrets. But I fully appreciate there has been a price to pay, and that, more often than not, others have had to pay it. I've always found it difficult to admit to mistakes. I had enough trouble conceding that I might possibly have made an error on the cricket field. My cricketing teammates will tell you that according to me, I was never ever out. If a bowler was lucky enough to take my wicket, I had a never-ending supply of excuses to run through when I got back to the dressing room, and I have to admit to serving up some real beauties in my time, like being put off by someone turning the page of his newspaper. Similarly, when I was bowling, if a batsman hit me for 4, it was not because he had played a good shot or I had bowled a bad ball. Invariably, it was all part of a grand plan, and it was simply a matter of time before he fell for it. I would come up with anything rather than admit that I.T. Botham had been at fault. It was a case of protecting my pride, making myself feel infallible. Perhaps the most embarrassing of these incidents was the time I went out to bat against Western Australia in Perth on the 1986 Seven Tour with a throbbing hangover and no bat. "Sorry about that, lads," I said as I slid back into the dressing room. "My bleeding back got stuck behind my pads." "I didn't notice they were strapped to your bleeding head," replied John Embury. The bottom line was immaturity. For me, the slightest admission of failure or inadequacy was out of the question, and it was the same whatever I did. If I drove a sports car, I had to drive it faster than anyone else. When I decided to try and raise money for leukemia, the only way to do it was to walk the length of the country, or over the Alps with some unenthusiastic elephants. And if I was drinking with my mates, I had to drink them under the table. I would try anything to show how big I was. It has taken me long enough to confront these facts, but I'm not afraid to do so now. When it comes to getting myself into hot water, a lot of what you will have heard and read about me is rubbish, but some of it is not. I've been a selfish bastard. I've been aggressive, tyrannical, chauvinistic, and hot-tempered. My only plea in mitigation is that if I hadn't been, none of what you are about to read would have ever taken place. I sometimes wonder what would have happened to the career of Ian Botham if Andy Roberts had not smashed my teeth in. I remember the occasion as though it was yesterday, and who wouldn't? After all, it's not often that you take a ball in the face from one of the greatest fast bowlers of all time and live to tell the tale. I only made the Somerset Benson Hedges quarter-final against Hampshire in June 1974 because our pace bowler Alan Jones was out with a leg strain, but I had already made my mark when I managed to remove Hampshire's premier batsman, the South African Test star Barry Richards. I took one more wicket that day, but when I came to bat, Somerset were more or less already dead and buried. 70 runs were required from the final 15 overs as I marched out to bat at number 9. Tom Cartwright, my batting partner, and the man I owe more than anyone for helping me become a top-class bowler, soon departed, caught at mid-on, and then, shortly after I had been joined by Hallam Moseley, it happened. Andy Roberts had been terrorising English county pros all season, playing for Hampshire, and was about to establish himself as the West Indies' main strike bowler for a decade. With 38 runs needed, hooking him for 6 seemed like a good idea at the time. But I paid for my foolishness when next ball, Roberts bowled me the fastest delivery I've ever seen, or to be more accurate, not seen. Halfway through getting into position to play the shot, the truth hit me, and then, a fraction or a second later, so did the ball. These were pre-helmet days, of course, but I did just manage to raise a gloved hand in front of my face, and that almost certainly saved me from serious injury. In the event, the force of the ball smacking into my glove, which then in turn smacked into my face, was still sufficient to knock out one tooth and break another clean in half, the teeth in question being on opposite sides of the jaw. By the time I had spat them out and had a spot of treatment, I was fully aware that there were some in the crowd who, believing that the game was up, wanted me to go off retired hurt to avoid further unnecessary punishment. The thought never crossed my mind. In fact, with mild concussion, there was very little crossing my mind. But, in a curious way, I think the incident helped to settle me down. I predicted that Roberts' next delivery would be a Yorker. Guessed right, and managed to get enough bat and ball to clip it away for 3 runs. From then on, I succeeded in farming as much of the strike as possible, so that after Hallam departed, there were just 7 runs needed to win from 16 balls when number 11 Bob Clapp joined me. Although those watching must have found the tension unbearable, my total concentration meant that I was in a cocoon. In the penultimate over, I played and missed 3 times before connecting with the winning hits of the cover boundary. As a batsman, Bob was what is commonly known as a ferret. He went in after the rabbits. But I will always be grateful to him for helping me make my name. He finished with one of the best not-outs in history. I collected the Gold Award, and the first chapter of the fairy tale was written. That evening, when I strode into the Gardener's Arms for a celebratory pint of beer and a spot of adulation, the local evening paper was waved under my nose. The headline read, "17-year-old Somerset youth plays a blinder." When the next day brought my first experience of national newspaper coverage, you could not see my head for the clouds. "Blood, sweat and cheers for Botham," announced the Guardian. "Young Botham, the Somerset hero," echoed the Daily Telegraph. Who was I to argue? The whole affair had an enormous effect on my career. Overnight, the country had been made aware of my existence. There is no doubt either that the publicity went straight to my head. Although my time on the Lord's ground staff had taught me many lessons, I was still young, raw, and very naive. In fact, even to get as far as I had done, I was extremely fortunate to have been in the presence of two men who, despite all my efforts to exasperate them, were prepared to encourage me. Brian Close, the man chiefly responsible for turning Somerset into a successful side, was a hard nut. A tough Yorkshireman who was never prepared to compromise. His whole approach to the game was based on absolute belief in his own ability, and that there was no point in turning up if you weren't prepared to do everything to win. He attained the double of 100 wickets and 1,000 runs in county cricket at the age of 18. However, his abrasiveness meant he was never likely to be a darling of the establishment. It was no surprise to anyone when he was sacked from the England captaincy after the Yorkshire side he was skippering were booed off the field following his time-wasting tactics that ensured a draw against Warwickshire in 1967. To others more mindful of personal safety, the call to return to Test cricket at the age of 45, after 9 years in the international wilderness, might have been answered with 2 fingers. But when the England captain, Tony Greig, decided he needed the physical equivalent of a brick wall to stand up to the West Indies pace attack that had been battering his team black and blue during the summer of 1976, it was absolutely typical of Closey that he accepted without a moment's hesitation. No one who witnessed it will ever forget his bravery when standing up to the horrendous onslaught from Roberts and Co. in the Manchester gloom. Even Clyde Lloyd, the West Indies captain, admitted his bowlers had gone over the top that day, but typical of Closey, he was just as proud of his bruises as he was of his batting. Starting out with Closey was vital for me because he taught me so much about attitude. He was the toughest man I ever played sport with or against, and he inspired us. He would never, ever give up. He was also a fearsome disciplinarian. His only disagreement with me on the field came because I had performed a brilliant run-out without due care and attention. A few weeks after the game against Hampshire, we were drawn against Surrey in the quarter-final of the Gillette Cup. I was bowling to Jeff Howarth, later to captain New Zealand, who proceeded to hit the ball back past me. I turned to my left with my back to play, fielded the ball, and as I noticed the batsman attempting a quick single, swivelled and hurled down the stumps. What I didn't know was that there had been a communication problem between the batsmen, and as they were both stuck down the striker's end, I could actually have walked up and quietly removed the bails. Closey berated me at length. I argued that no one had shouted to let me know where the batsmen were. His point was that I should have known. That incident taught me the lesson of thinking, even in pressure situations, that I never forgot, though I have to admit I didn't always follow it. Our successes in beating Surrey enabled me to put another of Closey's laws in practice in the semi-final against Kent. Although we lost by 3 wickets, I won a personal battle with Colin Cowdrey, one of the legends of the game. Closey instilled in me a feeling that I should never be overawed by reputation. Impose your will on your opponent rather than allowing him to do it to you. People often ask me then how I felt about bowling to a man like Cowdrey. For me, it made little difference. Partly due to my own self-confidence, and largely due to Closey's advice, I made a point of treating all batsmen alike, and I'm certain that I took Cowdrey's wicket that day simply because I believed I could. Tom Cartwright was the other major figure in my early development. Tom was an excellent all-rounder with Warwickshire, Somerset and England, and he was instrumental in helping me to get my early chances with Somerset after he watched me in the nets at Millfield School, where he had been coaching. He saw how desperate I was to become an all-rounder, and my enthusiasm must have struck a chord. Without his help, my bowling might simply have been ignored, as it was at my first opportunity at national level, the English Schools Under-15 Festival of 1969, staged in Liverpool. Tom took me under his wing and taught me the art of swing bowling. He ensured that Somerset recommended me to Len Munzer, the chief coach of the Lord's Ground Staff Boys, the nursery for young talent from all over the country. It was also Tom who persuaded Somerset to give me a chance in a couple of Sunday League games at the end of the 1973 season. It was in the first of these, a televised match against Sussex at Hove, that I took a sky in the deep to dismiss Tony Greig, a feat that played a large part in the club's offer of a contract. It was just as well that Tom and Closey put in the effort they did, because frankly, although it was an awful lot of fun, the education I received at Lord's was mainly concerned with extending my repertoire of ways to skate on thin ice. I thought Yeovil was a big town, but coming to Lord's in London in 1971 really opened my eyes to the big bad world. When I first arrived in the smoke, I was the original yokel, a 16-year-old Ian Bumpkin. The first thing that struck me about London was that everything was still switched on at 2 in the morning. In the West End at that time, there would be thousands of people milling around as if it were the middle of the afternoon. The first time I went into a strip club with the older ground staff boys, I just stood there laughing in amazement at these women dancing about and taking their clothes off. I really had no idea this sort of thing went on. I had a lot to learn, but I have to admit, I was a willing student. My big mate at the time was Rodney Ontong, from South Africa. We immediately hit it off. Our motto was work hard, then play hard. I would provide scrumpy from Yeovil, and Onty would arrive with his suitcase loaded with South African brandy. It was a gruesome combination, but it did the job. The only difference between us was that he managed to toe the line better than me when it came to discipline. He would make sure that he stayed on side with the coaches, Len Munzer and his assistant Harry Sharp. But I struggled with Len, who was one of the military school of cricketers, with razor-sharp creases in his flannels. What annoyed me most was that he had decided very early on that I couldn't bowl. That was absurd, because Somerset had sent me up as an all-rounder, not just a batsman who could bowl a bit. I wanted to be in the game as much as possible, and Len's resistance was a pain in the neck. Harry Sharp was different, and I have made a point of keeping in touch ever since. He would stand behind the net when I was batting, with half a fag stuck behind his ear, and deliver his verdict. "Bloody awful shot, Botham, but if you keep hitting it, son, you keep playing it." The £12 weekly wage did not go far. We were paid on Thursday, and by Sunday would be broke, so to stay alive we got up to tricks like jumping the barriers on the tube, and the great seat cushion scam. We would divert 100 or so seat cushions from their normal selling positions to the little booths where we worked selling scorecards. Then we offered them to spectators at 5p rather than the normal 10p hire charge. Call me Al Capone. Rodney and I even found a way to make money while gargling at the same time. Working behind the tavern bar during match days, we made sure that whenever a group of businessmen arrived, they received our undivided attention. Slowly but surely they ended up paying a bit more for each round of drinks, and of course, the more they imbibed, the less they cared. Needless to say, offers of "and one for yourself" were never knowingly refused. After a couple of hours of this, we would be staggering around, parrot-faced, making a complete cock-up of the orders and ringing up totals that bore absolutely no resemblance to the actual cost of the drinks. Another potential opportunity for cash prizes was the job of bowling at the MCC members in the nets. The ones we targeted for special treatment were known as the Jazz Hats, Flash Harrys who turned up in sports cars with all the latest gear fresh out of the wrapper, but who were potential big tippers. A lot of players who barely knew which end of a bat to pick up suddenly found themselves playing half volleys and middling the ball like world beaters, hearing exclamations of wonder at their superb stroke play and astonishment that they were not representing their county at the very least. If the fellow in question turned out to have short arms and deep pockets, however, the next time he turned up, it would be open warfare. In this way, taking my cricket seriously, but otherwise living for the moment without a care in the world, I spent the summer of 1972 at Lord's. I was due to return for 1973, but that was the season I broke through into the county circuit and became a regular in the Somerset second team. End of Side 1. Side 2. In Taunton, my initial fixed abode was in Greenway Road, where I was billeted with Dennis Breakwell, the slow left-arm bowler. It was called a club flat, but that was a breach of the Trade Descriptions Act. It was a tip. It was damp, there was no electricity or water. The toilet was outside and flushed with a bucket. We made sure to eat at the ground, or we raided the milk float in the morning, and we spent our evenings in the Gardener's Arms for a bit of warmth and light. Fortunately, by my breakthrough season in 1974, my salary had been doubled to £500 per annum, and Dennis and I found a new flat and a new flatmate, Viv Richards. Viv and I hit it off the first time we met. That moment something clicked between us, and that bond has remained ever since. Viv is totally committed to succeeding. He has an immense talent, and the best eye of any cricketer I have ever seen. He felt that any moment of the match, when he was not batting, was wasted. He told me that playing beach cricket on Antigua, he would be one of a huge crowd of kids waiting for their turn to bat. If you got out, it was possible you would not get another chance for days, so you did everything you could to stay in. These were heady times. The early successes were marvellous, but with them came local fame and aggro. with the so-called hard men wanting to prove to their mates that they were tougher than me, and I was never one who could turn the other cheek. Viv was a handy man to have around in a crisis. He was already tough, but I think his early experiences of racist remarks hardened him even more. Later on, when he was abused by idiots in the crowd at Headingley, it still hurt him deeply, which was why we were so thrilled by his reception when he bowed out from Test cricket in the final match of 1991 at the Oval. As he walked out to bat in his last innings, the crowd gave him a standing ovation all the way to the wicket. At the end of his knock of 60, during which he established a career Test batting average of over 50, they did the same. Halfway back to the dressing room, he stopped and acknowledged the gesture by raising his bat to all sides and doffing the maroon cap of the West Indies that meant so much to him. It was one of the great moments of cricket, and a privilege to have been there on the field. I noticed Kath, with more than passing interest, at a match in Weston-super-Mare. But I first met her in Leicester on the 26th of June 1974, when Jerry and Jan Waller accepted an invitation from their friend Brian Close to attend Somerset's Benson Hedges semi-final match against Leicestershire. Jerry and Kath's sister Lindsay arrived at the ground first, after travelling down from their home in Thorne near Doncaster, but Kath had stayed behind until her mum had finished her day's teaching. The pair drove down together, finally turning up at around 6 o'clock. By this time rain had brought proceedings to a soggy halt, and we were in the bar. Dennis Breakwell and I duly invited Kath and Lindsay out for a Chinese meal, and I spent the evening persuading Kath to come to Derby, where we were playing the following Sunday. I had competition. She had a boyfriend. However, my constant telephone calls did the trick, and a few weeks later, Jan, Jerry and Kath all travelled down to Taunton for a match and a meal afterwards with Closey and myself. It was after this that Jan made one of the worst character assessments of all time. "What a nice, quiet young man," she told her daughter. The courtship began in earnest. Kath was doing a business studies course at Lanchester Polytechnic in Coventry, and, in between times, working for her father, promoting high-quality drums used by some of the big-name rock stars. As our relationship blossomed, Kath arranged as many business trips as possible to coincide with my county games, and she would appear at cricket grounds wherever we were playing. In September, 3 months after we met, I proposed. We were convinced marriage was right for us. Our age didn't matter. Not surprisingly, however, our parents' reaction was different. My father wondered how on earth I could contemplate such a move on £500 a year. Kath's father, Jerry, humoured us. I don't think he thought we were serious. And the news had to be broken to Closey, who was Kath's godfather. Predictably, Closey exploded. We were far too young, and he was very concerned about Kath. Between marriage and my career, Kath had to understand that cricket came first. Undeterred, Kath and I kept to our plan. Having decided to live in the north, Kath found us a cottage in Mowbray Street, Epworth. Jan and Jerry gave us the deposit as a wedding present, and there I was, on the 31st of January 1976, married, housed, and established in the Somerset First 11 by the age of 20. Now the real work began. I was determined to succeed, and my cricket had to come first, no matter what the cost. At the beginning of August, I scored my maiden first-class century, 167 not out, to help Somerset beat Nottinghamshire at Trent Bridge. And to my delight, I was picked for England for the first one-day match against the West Indies at Scarborough on the 26th of August. Only years later, when it was too late to fully make amends, did I appreciate the effect this single-mindedness was having on Kath. When a player is establishing himself in a highly competitive environment, it is all too easy for him to forget, ignore, or simply be blind to the needs of his partner, and that, regrettably, was the case with our relationship. I was so focused, so self-centred, that Kath came second. She became so depressed that she sought medical advice, and we rowed and rowed. The situation was not helped by the fact that I insisted we lived in Yorkshire, while during the summer I would be based in Taunton. And when the opportunity arose of spending time at home, I managed to make things considerably worse by disappearing for games of golf. I'm happy to say that, against all the odds, Kath and I have managed to stick together. My whole world revolved around cricket, the team and my mates. By the time I got into that England side, for the one-day match, I must have been unbearable. I did not cover myself in glory on the field either, but I got the impression I had done enough to be selected for the upcoming winter tour of India. When I was not, to put it mildly, I sulked. Kath tells me I was hell to live with during the early part of that winter. Then, by the time I had settled down again, a call from Donald Carr, the secretary of the Test and County Cricket Board, threw our lives back into turmoil. I had been selected for the Whitbread Young Player Scholarship to Australia. I was thrilled, but 5 days after I arrived down under to begin the 3-month trip, I discovered that Kath was pregnant with Liam. As usual, I was busy enjoying myself, while Kath was coping alone and fed up. Then, by the time I returned, I'd managed to get involved in a punch-up with the former Australian captain Ian Chappell. I was drinking in a bar with players from both sides when Chappell started giving it the typical Aussie verbals and rubbishing England. I warned him that if he carried on there would be trouble. If there is one thing designed to make me see red, it is a loudmouth Aussie. 3 times I warned him, and 3 times he ignored me. Finally, I punched him. I didn't, as rumour has it, go after him with a bottle. At this time, Tony Greig was bringing about a revolution in world cricket. The England captain was a showman, a terrifically aggressive cricketer and shrewd. He knew that Test cricket had undersold itself, with the result that cricketers were among the paupers of international sport. Kerry Packer, the Australian television magnate, shared his view that something should be done to make cricket into a high-profile entertainment industry. Together, they came up with World Series cricket, in direct competition to Test cricket, and employing the best cricketers from every county. All hell broke loose. Long-standing friendships foundered. Many saw Tony Greig as a traitor. The International Cricket Council, the governing body of world cricket, announced a total test ban on all 35 players recruited to World Series cricket. Packer and Greig took them to the High Court, which then upheld their complaint over restraint of trade. But still those who joined Packer were out in the cold until he reached a compromise with the ICC in April 1979. This granted Packer's Channel 9 station exclusive rights to televise Test cricket down under. The wounds took a long time to heal, but one undeniable good thing came out of it. Professional cricket would never be as financially unrewarding again. I was selected for my first test, the third of England's Ashes series against Australia at Trent Bridge, on 28th of July 1977. I had no doubts that I was ready. Nevertheless, I was a bundle of nerves, and in the Trent Bridge dressing room that morning, I was barely capable of speech. By the time I was given the ball for my first spell in Test cricket, I was like a piece of elastic stretched to breaking point. As it turned out, had that been my second test, I might have taken a wicket with that first ball. Rick McCosker played nervously forward and edged the ball through the vacant third slip space. If I'd been sure of myself, I would have insisted to Briers that I should have 3 slips. What a start that would have been. The incident taught me a valuable lesson. Junior member of the team or not, from now on, I would insist on getting the field setting I wanted. The remainder of my first spell was a struggle. I was trying too hard, and the adrenaline was pumping too much. I was almost bursting out of myself. Consequently, I strayed down the leg side too often and was generally wayward. When Briers told me to have a blow, I felt disappointed. The question, is Botham good enough, remained unanswered. On seeing how pumped up I was, Briers decided to give me a second spell immediately after lunch, and then came the moment when everything that had happened in my life so far seemed to make perfect sense. Greg Chappell attempted to drive a short, wideish ball for me, which instead nicked the inside edge of his bat and rattled into his stumps. My heart tried to jump out of my chest. Of course, it was a lucky wicket, but to hell with that. I was in the book, and Greg Chappell, one of the greatest batsmen of all time, was my rabbit for the day. Flushed with success, I took the wickets of Doug Waters, Rod Marsh, Max Walker and Jeff Thompson. I finished with 5 for 74. It all happened so fast that I never really had a chance to savour the moment. All I recall is that they couldn't find a hat to fit my head for some time afterward. The one and only Sir Geoffrey Boycott made his long-awaited return to Test cricket in that match, and marked his comeback with a century, needless to say. I managed to make 25 with the bat, as we cruised to victory by 7 wickets. The only negative feature of the match being Boycott's run-out of his teammate Derek Randall. There is no doubt that my early success for England was due in no small part to having Mike Brearley as captain, as he proved by trusting me with that second crucial spell. He had this great knack of recognising what made every single player tick, and what was needed to bring out the best in them. He was as astute a captain as you will ever see. We brushed the Aussies aside at Headingley, thanks to Boyks, who followed up his Trent Bridge heroics with a massive 191 in the 4th Test at Leeds, thus becoming the first player to score his 100th first-class century in the Test arena. I got carried away by the excitement and my failed attempt to hit Ray Bright out of the ground meant my first test duck in only my second innings. The Aussies, shell-shocked at having to bowl at Boycott for 22.5 hours, capitulated without much of a fight in the first innings when I took 5 for 21, and we eventually crushed them by an innings and 85 runs. During this match, attempting to field the ball in the deep, I stepped on it, a particularly daft way of breaking a bone in my left foot, but indirectly, that changed my life. Returning to Somerset, I went for treatment at Musgrove Hospital in Taunton. I walked through a children's ward where there were kids with their arms in plaster, heads bandaged and legs in traction. At the end of the ward, I came across 4 youngsters sitting around a small table playing Monopoly. "What are they doing here?" I asked the specialist. "Visiting, are they?" "No," he replied. "They're suffering from leukemia. 2 of them have very little time to live." It was shattering news for me. In that moment, all the self-satisfaction of the past couple of weeks disappeared. How could these children, who looked to the naked eye as right as rain, be about to die? I suddenly thought of Kath and the baby we were expecting, and a shiver went down my spine. The doctor then told me the hospital could no longer afford the annual party for the children, which for some of them would be literally the only thing they could ever look forward to again. I paid. They just wanted sausage rolls, party hats and the like. I wanted to do something, and it was the only thing I could think of. Over the years, the seed that was planted in me that day grew and grew. A few days later, I was in hospital again to witness the birth of my son Liam. It was far from straightforward. Kath was in labour for over 26 hours and had a terrible time. When I entered the delivery room, she was in absolute agony, crawling around on her hands and knees and screaming in pain. What none of us knew until later was that Liam had been in an inverted position in Kath's womb. I was present at the birth, although by that stage Kath was so exhausted that she probably had no idea I was there at all. It was an extremely emotional moment for both of us. Indeed, the whole experience had been so harrowing for Kath that she went private for the birth of our second child, Sarah. That winter of 1977-78 was my first overseas tour to Pakistan and New Zealand, another particularly difficult time for Kath. Here I was disappearing again only a couple of months after Liam's birth. Everything in life revolved around thoughts of the tour. I was terribly excited and determined this was going to be the start of something big. That something big turned out to be a tour around the toilets of Pakistan, laid low by the dreaded belly bug. Part of the education process I was undergoing at the time was learning about my teammates in the England setup. The things that make Jeff Boycott tick would give Mike Brearley enough material for a dissertation in his current career as a psychoanalyst. But during this formative period of my career, the biggest impression he made on me was what a selfish person he can be. Of course, all top sportsmen need to have that quality, but in my opinion, Boycott simply went too far, too often. The first time I had seen Boycott's egotistical nature at work on the field had been during my test debut at Trent Bridge, when he played the ball towards a fielder he had not noticed in the covers and set off for a suicidal single, except he had no intention of committing suicide. Derek Randall, playing at the other end, had to sacrifice his wicket, allowing Boycott to remain to go on to make what was admittedly a terrific 100. Boycott's attitude then, and forever after, was that he was the best batsman in the side, and therefore it was always the other batsman who should sacrifice his wicket. Mike Brearley suffered a broken arm, and Boycott took over as captain for the New Zealand leg of the tour. That first test at Wellington was one of the strangest I've ever played in. After 48 years and 48 tests, it was the Kiwis' first win over England. Strong winds blew throughout the match and seemed to affect our Geoffrey. When he came out to bat, I was witness to one of the most tedious innings I've ever seen in my life. Boyk's 77, made on the third day, went like this: 10 in the first hour, 12 in the second, 6 in the third, including a boundary, 12 in the fourth. The innings lasted 7 hours, 22 minutes, and he faced 304 balls. I felt like calling international rescue. As a team, we must have been bored out of our minds because we fell apart, though in fairness, Richard Hadley bowled brilliantly and took 10 wickets for 100. Boycott's behaviour in the second test at Christchurch was even more amazing. We were determined to level the series, and I was lucky enough to score my maiden test 100 in a big first innings total. Then, when we eventually bowled New Zealand out, we desperately required quick runs to give us enough time to bowl them out a second time and win the match. Boyce knew exactly what was needed. but he was so wrapped up in his own performance that he failed to get the scoreboard moving. Consequently, Bob Willis, the vice-captain, sent me out to the crease with the most extraordinary of instructions concerning England's opening batsman, Geoffrey Boycott. "Go and run the bugger out," Willis said. So I did, by about 10 yards. I hit the ball into the offside and called him for a run. He never stood a chance. On being given out by the umpire, he just turned and looked at me blankly. By the close of play, we had a lead of 279. But when I got back to the dressing room, Boyce was sulking and not talking to anyone. Certainly not to me. We declared at the overnight total, then bowled New Zealand out easily to win by lunchtime on the final day. That morning session was bizarre. Boyce was still not talking to me, so when I was bowling, he communicated with me via the other fielders. No matter, the victory was especially sweet for me, because my first Test 100 had proved to me that I was learning about the game. In my early career, batting was straightforward. Get out there and give it a whack was my philosophy. But to succeed at the highest level, I had to give it a bit more thought than that. My experiences in the first Test at Wellington helped me make the century in the second at Christchurch. At Wellington, Richard Hadley got me out twice by tempting me into the hook and getting me caught 7 and 19 respectively. I remembered the lesson. At Christchurch, when Hadley bowled short, I let the ball go. It was still an aggressive innings, but it was controlled aggression. It was a lovely feeling to have reached this milestone. I was well on the way to establishing myself, and the following summer against Pakistan, I managed to do just that. In the first Test at Edgbaston, I made another century in our victory, and it was here that I had my first encounter with the kind of controversy that has cast a constant shadow over all my dealings with Pakistan. Iqbal Qasim came to the crease late on the Saturday evening to see out the last over, which he did with ease. Then on the Monday, he survived a number of lifting deliveries from Willis without any fuss. When Willis tried another approach, by coming round the wicket, he caught Qasim with a lifter that hit him in the mouth, forcing him to retire hurt. The Pakistan manager, Mahmood Hussain, accused Willis of using unfair tactics, but as I saw it, the problem was the visitors were heading for defeat. The way Qasim had batted up until that point proved he was no rabbit. Nevertheless, in the interests of fairness, a compromise was reached between the two managements, and the teams went into the next match at Lord's with a collective total of 5 players classified as non-batsmen and to be spared the ordeal of the bouncer. Willis and Hendrick were the English players, while the Pakistanis had preservation orders slapped on Qasim, Sikandar Bakht and Liaquat Ali. The protection, however, did not spare them from defeat, as I enjoyed my best match yet for England. I scored my third Test century, 108, as we reached 364. In their first innings, Willis took 5 wickets, and Phil Edmonds 4 to force the follow on. And second time round, I took 8 wickets for 34. Then 7 wickets as their last 8 fell for 43, to complete the best return by an England bowler since Jim Laker had taken 9 for 37 and 10 for 53 against Australia in 1956. They tell me that this was the best all-round performance ever by an England player. New Zealand were our next opponents. My bowling continued to reap rewards. In the 3-match series, I took 6 for 34, 6 for 101 and 5 for 39 as we completed 3 straight wins. That marked the end of my first year in Test cricket, and off the field things were going fantastically well too. The Fleet Street publicity machine was working overtime to keep tabs on the new superstar. The sponsorship deals, newspaper articles and all the other trappings of success were becoming part of our everyday lives. Unfortunately, these developments simply caused more problems for Kath. We were spending less time in each other's company. Most of the functions to which I was invited were men only, while the rest of the time was usually spent enjoying rounds of golf or nights in Somerset pubs. Then came the winter trip to Australia. Kath made it clear that the prospect of another long separation did not fill her with joy. Kath was pregnant again, and doctors said she could only come for the first 2.5 weeks. The TCCB have never been keen on wives coming, but we wrote off with a formal request. It was refused, and I got nowhere insisting, so I issued an ultimatum. If you won't allow Kath to join me, I shall withdraw from the tour. That worked. Many observers chose to concentrate on the fact that we achieved our 5-1 success under Brearley against an Aussie side badly damaged by defections to Packer, but they forget that we had lost some great players of our own. The facts are that Breers was the first England captain since Douglas Jardine in the 1932-33 Bodyline series to win 4 tests on an Ashes tour down under. And England had never beaten the Aussies by a margin as large as 5-1. On flying home in mid-February, I met my daughter Sarah for the first time. She had been born 2 weeks before I returned, and thankfully without any of the traumas Kath had suffered over Liam's birth. But the wheels of international cricket continued to turn. The first half of the home summer of 1979 was taken up with the World Cup, where I made the first of my 2 appearances in a final at Lord's. We were well beaten in this instance, Viv Richards taking us apart with an awesome 138 not out, and Collis King's late blitz taking the West Indies to 286. The World Cup was followed by a 4-test series against India, during which I got back in the groove, twice taking 5-wicket hauls in an innings and making my top test score to date of 137. The victory by an innings and 83 runs in the first test at Edgbaston enabled us to win the series 1-0, but not until we had survived a thrilling draw in the 4th and final test at the Oval, when Sunil Gavaskar made a memorable 221. That match also marked a personal milestone for me in reaching 1,000 runs and 100 wickets in Test cricket, quicker than anyone had ever done before. The least said about my second innings in that match, the better. I was run out for naught. No prizes for guessing that my batting partner was G. Boycott. The winter of 1980 should have been feeding time for Beefy again, with a short tour to Australia, followed by a 1-match trip to Bombay for the Indian Golden Jubilee Test. Sadly, the Aussies had got their act together after the Packer defections, and despite my haul of 11 wickets in the first test at Perth, they won by 138 runs. The next game at Sydney was theirs, and by the third game, it was all over for us. India was a huge culture shock, a thrilling and magnificent country. This was the trip where I really got to know Chris Lander, who was later to become an essential member of the Leukemia Walk team. It was also the tour where he picked up the nickname Crash. After a few drinks, Lander somehow ended up on stage, instead of the hotel cabaret, performing the original karaoke. Then Crash went headfirst into the audience. The nickname was born. On the field, my performance went quite the other way. I made a century and took 13 wickets, and that probably secured for me the job of England captain. England failed to win a test while I was captain, and to a certain extent, my form deserted me. But I was bound to have a poor run of form somewhere. That it happened while I was captain of my country, I believe, was coincidence. Most of the captains I've played under have thought enough of my tactical awareness to have used me as a sounding board. That was certainly true of Mike Gatting, David Gower, and to a lesser extent, Mike Brearley. During the winter of 1979-80, against an Australian side which had just welcomed back the Packer players, Breers co-opted me onto the England selection committee. He had already made up his mind that he did not want to go abroad in the winter with England again, so a new captain had to be found. Brian Close, who was an England selector at the time, was the only one who was violently opposed to making me captain. He was convinced that at 24, I was not ready for it yet. My own game would suffer from the burden of responsibility, he reasoned, and I was too naive and inexperienced, not to mention headstrong, to cope with the man management side of the job. As far as the latter point, Closey was probably right. Man management meant little to me, nor when it came to playing for England did motivation. Why should anyone need motivating when they are playing for their country? Basically, my approach to man management amounted to little more than making sure nobody drank alone and everyone got their round in at the bar. Whatever my failings in that department, when I took on the job of captaincy, I was absolutely convinced that I could do it. Whatever misgivings Closey had, there were no doubts in my mind. If you are offered the captaincy of England, the only possible answer is yes, any time, any place, anywhere. There is no greater honour than to lead your country. What I didn't know at the time was that I had just sustained a back injury. The pain was no bother to begin with, but during that summer it got progressively worse, until X-rays revealed that I had a deformity of the spine. An operation was considered, but it was felt that it might put extra strain on the adjoining vertebrae. I bowled through varying degrees of pain from that day on, and by and large I succeeded in putting it to the back of my mind, until in 1988 the operation became a necessity. My reign as England captain began with the 2 one-day prudential matches against the West Indies at the end of May 1980. The series ended 1-1, but the West Indies took the trophy on a higher scoring rate over the 2 matches. It was not a bad introduction to the England captaincy, but there is a world of difference between a one-day international and a test match, and when I was appointed to the latter role, I was thrilled. I was the youngest England captain, so they told me, since Ivo Bligh in 1882-83. Incidentally, Ivo's other claim to fame was to lead his side to the defeat that prompted those ladies of Melbourne to burn the bales and present the ashes to him in an urn. My introduction to Test cricket was a back-to-back series with the West Indies and a centenary test against the Australians in between, and in those days England were facing a mighty West Indies side. Gordon Greenidge and Desmond Haynes were the openers, followed by Viv Richards, Alvin Kalikaran and Clive Lloyd. As for the bowling, Malcolm Marshall, Andy Roberts, Joel Garner and Michael Holding made up one of the most awesome attacks ever seen in Test cricket. My first test in charge against the West Indies at Trent Bridge was a tremendous match, with the game just going their way. The second test at Lord's was affected by rain and came to a draw. Again, the weather dominated at Old Trafford for the third test, and another draw. At the Oval, our best batting performance of the summer put us in the driving seat as we finished our first innings with 370 on the board. I then claimed my 150th Test wicket, the sweet prize of Viv Richards, who was brilliantly held by Peter Willey in the gully. The advantage, however, quickly swung away from us at that point. Time ran out, and our chance of winning the series went with it. We finished the series with another draw at Leeds. There was no break for the team. We warmed up for the centenary test with 2 comfortable one-day international victories over the Australians at the Oval and Edgbaston. Then once again the weather intervened to spoil the big day at Lord's. It was not much of a game. The main talking point was the scuffle on the Saturday afternoon, during which 2 MCC members had a set-to with umpire David Constant. Chappell and I had to step in to cool down the situation, and when the umpires eventually came out to start play, they had to have a police escort through the long room. That said a lot about a section of the MCC membership. A tame draw marked the end of the season for me, and it was back home for a break and a change, to go fishing and play some football. What should have been a quiet time turned out to be nothing of the sort. I've always enjoyed my football, and I'd had a few games for Scunthorpe Reserves. I played 2 first-team games for them, coming on as a substitute, and I was still a registered non-contract player for the next season, and would train with the players. I got on particularly well with the goalkeeper, Joe Neenan. Every Christmas the team had a night out in Scunthorpe, and I was invited along. The fortunes of Scunthorpe were hardly soaring at the time, because they had just lost a second-round FA Cup replay against non-league Altrincham, and Joe gave away a penalty. We went to a nightclub called Tiffany's and had a few drinks. Joe had some stick from some troublemakers, and there was a bit of a scuffle. Eventually, when we left, Joe encountered his friends again, and they refused to leave it alone. Stupidly, they carried on baiting him. Finally, our patience snapped, and we chased them down the road. Joe cornered this bloke, Stephen Isbister, and thumped him, and that seemed to settle things. The next day, however, all hell broke loose. The newspapers were full of stories. Ian Botham beat me up. Joe and myself were charged with assault, occasioning actual bodily harm, and the case came up at Scunthorpe Magistrates Court in January 1981. Joe was fined £100 plus costs, while I pleaded not guilty and elected for trial in the Crown Court. The TCCB were not overjoyed about the England captain facing assault charges, and it took about a year before the case came to its conclusion, and I was acquitted. This was the start of the bad publicity, the snowball that soon became an avalanche. The 1980-81 tour to the Caribbean that followed was beset by difficulties. In the first 7 weeks we managed only 17 days of cricket. The weather was untypical, we had the Jackman-Guyana affair, and worst of all, Ken Barrington, the assistant manager and coach, and a close personal friend, died of a heart attack. Kenny's death was a stunning and awful blow. Kenny was a tremendous influence on me. I used to terrorise him with practical jokes, but we all had a huge amount of respect for him, and he was always genuinely concerned with our problems. We started with a 190-run win over the young West Indian 11 in Trinidad, then won 2 one-day games in the Windward Islands before the first one-day international in St Vincent, which we lost by 2 runs. The first test was at Port of Spain in Trinidad, where we lost by an innings and 79 runs, 1 down in the series, and our key strike bowler, Bob Willis, who had been struggling with a serious knee injury, had to fly home. This was a blow. Not only was Bob my vice-captain, but he was also a good friend and ally. His replacement, the Surrey pace bowler Robin Jackman, flew out to join us in Guyana. but Jackman had played in South Africa. His visitor's permit was withdrawn, and the Guyanese authorities told him to leave the country. The tour manager, A.C. Smith, responded by saying that England would not play the second test because it was no longer possible for us to select the team of our choice. A.C. did a bloody good job during this fiasco, as he did later after Kenny died. The atmosphere became very unpleasant, and we were effectively prisoners at our hotel. The second test match was duly cancelled, and we left. The other Caribbean countries were anxious that the tour should proceed, and a highly relieved England party landed to a warm welcome in Barbados. I then had to confront the problem of who should take over from Bob Willis as vice-captain. I chose Graham Gooch, only for Lords to veto me. I had approached Graham, and he was happy to accept. I put my thoughts to A.C. Smith and Kenny Barrington, and they supported me. Then the board said, no, Jeff Miller is the vice-captain. I was stunned, and argued the point, but Alec Bedser and the selectors had made a decision from London that was non-negotiable. I had to tell Graham, and following that difficult conversation was another with Jeff Miller. Jeff was surprised. He actually said that it could be embarrassing because he would not be in the side for all the tests. Exactly the point I was trying to make with the board. It was then in Barbados, on that fateful third test, that Kenny Barrington died on the evening of 14th of March, the second day of the game. The West Indies won easily, but the team held together well under the circumstances and went to Antigua for the fourth test, where we came out of the match with a comfortable draw. From Antigua, we moved on to Jamaica and then home. The series lost 2-0. The West Indies had been a big learning experience. Several of the players had produced excellent performances, and despite our problems, I was not too disappointed with my own contribution as captain. My approach to the job has always been very positive. I don't agree with talking about the opposition, discussing the strengths and weaknesses of each and every player. I find it boring and counterproductive. It's what you can do as individuals and a team that counts. I firmly believe in simply psyching one another up over a beer or two. If you worry about what your opponents are going to do rather than what you are going to do to them, then you may as well pack up before you start. But this approach was not enough for my critics, and the rug was being pulled from under my feet. I was made captain again for the one-day games against Australia at the start of the 1981 summer series. But then, for the forthcoming test series, the England selectors made the decision to let me captain the side on a match-by-match basis. I stayed on for the first two tests, but by then I had decided that my time was up as captain, and I handed in my resignation. It was a very low point in my life. Yet even then, I was stripped of any dignity when 15 minutes after handing in my notice, Alec Bedser told the press we were going to sack him anyhow. I drove down to Taunton that evening, and armed with a bottle of gin and with Viv Richards as my companion, I talked through my troubles. Suddenly, nothing seemed so black, and the clouds started to part. End of side 2.